I love the palpable sense of discomfort when Americans come here and try to make Europeans do audience participation. It's amazing. So my talk today is going to be on community-powered chef. There's a little byline I'll talk about later, which is how being involved with the community actually ended up getting me left in charge of chef. So this is me. I'm a staff operations engineer at Etsy, so I work on the production operations team, so what you might call a sysadmin. If you're not familiar with Etsy, we're a US-based online marketplace for handmade and vintage goods. As we like to say, we let you buy good things from real people. So what I'm going to start off by doing is by talking a little bit about how I started off using Chef, a little bit about my background, because that kind of frames some of the other stuff I'm going to talk about. So I first encountered Chef when I was working in London in 2010 at a company called Revu. They do like third-party reviews for Tesco and various car manufacturers and places like that. This was back in the day when Chef was called Ops Code. This was the first time I ever encountered configuration management, let alone Chef. And I turned up at this company fairly junior at the time, and they introduced me to these recipes they were writing that configured their servers, and it was a revelatory moment. It honestly was. So around about this time, I started off with my first encounter with someone from the chef community, because I was online at the time in IRC channels asking what I felt like were really stupid questions. And although he possibly doesn't know it yet, and he is in the room, so if anyone's sitting next to him and he's blushing, just sort of point at him and laugh. He was the first person I actually interacted with in the chef community, and that very much set the tone for how I, as a newcomer to the community, ended up feeling. Because Josh was extremely welcoming. He was very, very patient with answering questions, and it made me feel like, hey, this is a community that I might do well in. He also gives awesome hugs. Now, hugs are this thing they do in America to express affection towards other people. They're what would be the equivalent in Britain of a firm handshake or a slight incline of the head. If you would like to practice your hugging, I encourage you to find Josh later on. He'll give you an example of this quaint Americanism. So around about this time, when I was at Revu, I had really gotten the chef bug. I ended up moving on to another startup also based in London called A-Frame, who do video production workflows for broadcast media and that kind of things. And this was the time where I'd really been bitten by the bug, and I just wanted to chef everything I could get my hands on. And I went to this startup. I was going to change the world. I was going to chef everything. I was going to build amazing infrastructure. It was going to be wonderful. That isn't quite how things work in startups, it turns out. Startups are largely driven by two things: putting out fires and acquiring funding. And I was doing far too much of the former, and the latter was far too late in happening. So I moved on to where I am now, which is Etsy. And one of the reasons I was brought on at Etsy was because by this time I was fairly familiar with using Chef. I wasn't doing particularly much with it, but I could write recipes. I knew the basic resources and that kind of stuff, which is what Etsy were looking at the time. So at the time I joined Etsy, they'd also, this was still only sort of late 2011, so Chef was still relatively, it hadn't been around for all that long then. So when I joined Etsy, I'm pretty sure this is an accurate quote from the film. When I joined Etsy, it felt kind of familiar because they were using what I recognized as Chef. They were using recipes and things like that. But then I started running into what was a fairly common problem in those days, which was that it didn't work quite the way I wanted it to. The things I wanted it to do in the way I wanted it to do it weren't quite happening out of the box. And certainly in those days, that was almost an actual design principle of Chef. Chef is designed to cover general bases. It was designed to be a toolkit that would let you solve problems, but it wouldn't guarantee to do everything for you. So it was at this point I started writing and open sourcing tools. Just to refer to one of the previous speakers, turns out that changing version numbers in cookbooks is actually a problem a lot of people have. So one of the plugins does actually do that for you. You can find all my tooling on Chef Supermarket under the username Jon Lives. But at the time I was trying to write tools to solve problems we were having that weren't quite covered by out-of-the-box Chef. Because I work at Etsy, who are very supportive of their employees doing things like coming to talk, I started talking about problems I've been trying to solve because I figured maybe other people have those problems too. Turns out people are still trying to fix bumping cookbook version numbers. And sometimes I get a little bit carried away. I ended up writing a book by accident, which was all about trying to customize Chef out of the box to do all of these things. And this was all because of and for the chef community. The reason I stayed in the chef community was because of interactions with people like Josh Timberman, who are, when I was in the very early stages of learning about chef, were answering my questions and answering like what I felt like were stupid questions about resources and how do I recipe and things like that. And a lot of the reason that stuff's open sourced and is still used is because the chef community had similar problems to me and were giving back and were contributing pull requests and things like that too. But the chef community today is quite different to the chef community in 2010 when I started using Chef. I'm actually going to quote something Nathan said to me the other day, which is one of the ways that the chef community is changing is the builders are becoming consumers. And that doesn't mean people are just sort of like sucking in other people's work like sponges. What that means is back in 2010, Chef was a much more new product and it didn't have the kind of rich ecosystem of tooling and products around it that it does now. You got the base of Chef, what you see when you look at the resources list on the Chef docs, you know, cookbook file, template, all that kind of stuff. That's what you got out of the box, and you got knife with its basic commands. So the general use pattern with Chef, and the reason tools like Berkshelf and Spark came about, was because people were trying to solve things that Chef didn't quite natively do, so they ended up building their own solution. What's happening now, if you fast forward 4 or 5 years, is there's much more tooling and ecosystem around Chef. You have Chef Delivery, you have Chef Compliance, Chef Analytics, Chef Reporting, all these other things that mean if you're trying to solve a roughly baseline problem with Chef, there's a much greater chance that you're going to be able to drop in a solution that does a much higher percentage of the stuff. So it's becoming a more common pattern, especially as Chef gets much more penetration in large enterprises who have things like compliance and reporting and all those kind of requirements, that you're going to be able to drop in a solution and kind of consume Chef rather than having to build it yourself. But what this means is that because a greater percentage of the community are consuming and not building, it's also much more important to gather perspective from the community. You individually out there, your perspective on Chef is more important than it's ever been, because you work for companies that have unique problems that potentially no one else is trying to solve in the world. Maybe you're the first company in your particular market that's solving a particular problem. And that perspective is vitally important to Chef. Another thing that's particularly important, as Harm said so well earlier on, is the tech industry isn't exactly known for its fantastic diversity. And part of that important perspective comes from people who effectively are different to me, who are not all three of the straight white male kind of trinity that's so prevalent in the industry. So part of the perspective that we need in the community also comes from those from different backgrounds, from different upbringings, from different, different origins, different economic backgrounds even. And with Chef, and in this case I mean Chef the community, not Chef the product, the way Chef is organized now means that you have the power to both give that perspective and to also influence the way Chef evolves with that perspective. You have the power to make Chef evolve into what you want it to be. So what I want to talk about a little bit now, just to give you a kind of rough overview of the way things are actually structured, is how the Chef community fits together. The first thing to note is that all roles in the Chef community are open to everyone. That means that nothing is restricted to only Chef employees. The Chef community as a whole is driven by RFCs. If you're not familiar with them, RFC stands for Request for Comment. It's a bit of a misleading name, but what it basically means is it's a way of defining standards that dictate that we have agreed this particular thing will be done in this particular way. It's also what dictates standards like HTTP, SMTP, things like that. You can look up the RFC and you can read the standard, and in theory, that will give you the implementation of the thing. This is also the way the Chef community works, so anything that is implemented in Chef, any new feature that's added or any change, even the way the community works, is done by an RFC. So it's all there on GitHub for everyone to see. There's a weekly meeting. It's at 5 p.m. every Thursday, 5 p.m. UK time every Thursday in the Chef Hacking IRC channel on Freenode. It's open to everyone. It's not restricted to Chef employees or community members or anything. And we discuss the RFCs. We discuss upcoming updates with Chef and so on. But the bulk of the meeting revolves around discussing these RFCs, and everyone's opinion's equal there. If there's a particular RFC that's coming up for something you particularly care about, you can come into that meeting, you can give your opinion, it'll be given equal weight to that of Adam Jacob, the CTO, because the chef community recognizes that that varied perspective is important, because chef is built from this idea that everyone's trying to solve different problems, and chef kind of serves as the glue that kind of gives you the tools to do that. One particularly important thing to note, I don't work for chef, I'm standing up here talking about this. Chef employees don't get any more power in the community than we do. Certain roles are occupied by chef employees, but that's not some divinely inherited right. That's purely because they had the interest and were acknowledged by their peers to be good fits for that role. But chef employees don't have any more power to dictate what goes into Chef, the open source product, than I do or anybody else involved in the community. And what this means is you can either work on the overall Chef project itself. I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of rules that allows in a second. Or you can also work on things you specifically care about. For example, if you're only using Windows, chances are you're not going to be particularly interested in the FreeBSD specific parts of Chef, or vice versa. So the way the community is organized looks something like this. I'll break, the font's a little bit small, but I'm going to break these down later. At the top of the pile, you have the project lead, and slightly off to the right, you have RFC editors. I'll explain these a little bit later. But most other stuff is broken down into component-specific groups. So a component would be something like the core of Chef Client, which is anything non-platform specific. You also have components for specific things like CentOS, Windows, FreeBSD, AIX, any particular operating system specific distribution. You also have components for the testing tools, for command line tools, for things like that. So the first role I want to talk about is the project lead. This is usually Adam Jacob. He is the CTO of Chef, and he's also the, I believe, the J in the HJK solutions that originally became Opscode that then became Chef. The project lead is not some kind of benevolent dictator. The project lead exists to largely resolve disputes. If there's a dispute around a particular feature, the project lead is the overall kind of arbiter who can say, I think we should look more at this, or this is the way I think we should go, and so on and so on. The project lead's also responsible for providing the overall vision of Chef the project and the kind of overarching roadmap of what happens. The project lead also has universal veto power. Part of this comes from the fact that Chef is a company that needs to make money. And there is, in theory, a possibility that someone with a commit bit could put something in Chef that might harm that ability. So purely for pragmatic reasons, the project lead maintains universal veto power over everyone else in that tree. Although I have to say, to this day, I do not believe that power has ever actually been exercised in that context. There can also only be one project lead. Well, that line's fairly self-explanatory. On the Chef component side, as I mentioned, you have a variety of different components: core, testing, operating specific, etc. And those are made up of the people who care most in the Chef community about that specific thing. If you care about Windows, you can participate in the Windows-specific parts of Chef. FreeBSD, likewise. Maintainers of components. So a maintainer is a person who has a commit bit. You get the commit bit on overall Chef, you're largely focused on that component. Maintainers have full agency over their component. So if you're a maintainer of the Windows component of Chef, you do not need to get permission from your lieutenant who sits at the top to make a particular change. Changes are ratified by if two maintainers approve a change, it goes through. If one maintainer votes against, it goes to full vote of all maintainers with a simple majority winning. Again, the lieutenant doesn't exist to exercise power. The lieutenant of a component exists to resolve disputes. Lieutenants also have veto power over their specific component, not the overall project. Again, to my knowledge, this power has never actually been used, so at the moment it exists kind of in potentia. Lieutenants would generally give, if someone wanted to make a particular decision about, say, FreeBSD Chef, the lieutenant exists largely to make sure that nothing's going in there that compromises the overall ability of FreeBSD users to effectively use Chef. So I want to talk a little bit more about the RFC side of things, which is how the kind of decisions and features that maintainers and lieutenants are working off actually. Oh, one more thing I will say about maintainers and lieutenants. Every single Chef employee who has access to commit code to Chef is either a maintainer or a lieutenant. They do not get that right automatically. For a Chef employee to be able to commit code to Chef core, they have to be a maintainer of Chef core. Otherwise, they have to submit a pull request and get someone to approve it, same as I do, same as everyone else does. So this is what I mean. One of the things I personally like the most about the Chef community is Chef employees, although paid to work on Chef full time, have parity with the rest of the community in what they can actually do to change Chef. So RFCs are the way those changes get made. As I mentioned, they stand for request for comments. Anyone can propose an RFC. You do not have to be a maintainer or a lieutenant or anything. Any of you in this room, if you have a particular desire to see a feature in Chef, you can write an RFC, you can submit a pull request, and that RFC will get discussed at one of the community meetings, the same as any other RFC will. RFC editors, they're on the side of that diagram, basically exist to guide you through that process. There are particular requirements for RFCs around formatting, like what metadata you have to include at the top, the kind of contents we expect to see. RFC editors exist if you just want to submit a pull request and it doesn't meet those requirements. The editor is the person who will help you through that process and be like, well, thanks for your RFC, but we need to see this bit, and then they'll help you figure out what you need to add. Once an RFC has been approved, anyone can implement it. If you see an RFC for a feature you want in Chef and it doesn't look like anyone's working on it, you can go ahead and implement that and do a pull request, and if the pull request meets the requirements of the RFC, your code will get into Chef. Conversely, submitting a proposal doesn't mean that you personally have to implement it. It's a fact that probably not everyone in this room is a developer or would consider themselves a particularly advanced coder. But you might have opinions on particular features about Chef. So you can submit an RFC, which can be ratified during the weekly meeting and approved, and someone else can implement it. I actually submitted an RFC to get metadata tags added in Chef that let you know what version of Chef Client and Ohio cookbook's compatible with, which has been something asked for quite a while. I meant to implement it, never quite got around to it, so recently Lamont Granquist from Chef implemented that RFC. My proposal, but he did the work. That's a thing as well. If you're not confident with coding, that doesn't mean you can't let people know what you think Chef should look like. So that's the way the community kind of is organized in the background. I just want to run through quickly the particular roles I have, since I'm kind of talking about my journey through Chef. I'm one of the RFC editors, so if you submit an RFC, I'm one of 3 or 4 people who basically our job is to help you get that RFC to the kind of RFC spec. I'm also the lieutenant for Red Hat and CentOS. Another thing I didn't mention before, although we alluded to it with the code of conduct, is that all interactions with the Chef community on any form of social media platform have what are called community advocates. And what that means is we are the people who, if there's someone's being particularly obnoxious, or if someone has a specific issue with someone else, or there's an incident of harassment or something like that, we are the people who are responsible for making sure that that is dealt with and does not get ignored. The Chef community is designed to be welcoming to everyone from all backgrounds, all origins. Any particular uniquely distinguishing characteristic does not exclude you from participation in the community, and you should not be treated differently because of it. So the community advocates exist to make sure that that actually happens. In my case, I'm one of the ones for the IRC channels. There's actually an RFC in the RFC's repo that lists the rest of them. If you have an issue in IRC, come speak to me and I'll try my best to help. I'm a maintainer on the Red Hat and Chef core components, largely because, as I said, these are the things that I care most about. Etsy is primarily Red Hat, well, CentOS based, and we have a fair amount of fairly advanced Chef knowledge in-house, so we care a lot about how the Chef core component work. So because those are the things we most care about, the reason I became a maintainer for those components is I've put safeguard in inverted commas, not to say that anyone is going to, I'm not making sure that only our use case is fitted, but to make sure that we have a stake in the things we care about, that we can make sure those things continue to work for us as well as for everybody else. So up until fairly recently, those were the roles I had. I'm not a particularly active developer on Chef. I'm more active in the meetings, RFCs, IRC, things like that. But then I got a Google Hangouts call from Adam Jacob earlier on this year. Adam had basically he'd been building Chef along a bunch of other people for something approaching 9 years at that point, and he'd never once taken a vacation in that time. Turns out that's kind of bad for you. So Adam decided in 2015, now this community process was actually a living, breathing thing. He decided he wanted to go on holiday. Actually, specifically, he wanted to go to Mexico for a month with his wife and not have to check email or anything. But the problem is, Adam's the project lead. That power had never been delegated to anyone else. He's the CTO of Chef, so he is the ultimate arbiter of what goes on. So how is he going to take a holiday? So Adam and the Chef board took independently of the fact it was me he talked to, what I think is possibly one of the bravest things any company involved in open source has done, which was they effectively decided to hand the keys to the kingdom to someone else who wasn't employed by Chef. I don't take orders from Chef. I don't collect a paycheck from Chef. Chef can't ring me up and say, you need to reject this pull request because we don't like it. Which also led to me at ChefConf this year having an interesting conversation with Barry, where I basically had to introduce myself and said, hey, I'm going to be in charge of your product for a month. Nice to meet you. So, and Barry was super cool about it as well. Obviously, he'd been involved in this decision. It wasn't just landed on him. But I had this legitimate conversation where Barry's the CEO of Chef. He has effectively hiring and firing power of everyone who works for him. But he doesn't have hiring or firing power over me. I can't lose my job if I happen to annoy Barry. And conversely, because of this community process, Barry couldn't tell me what to do with Chef. So one of the things I did have to do was promise to Adam and Barry I wasn't going to make any sweeping architecture changes without checking with anyone else. But largely, this is how much Chef trust and empower the community to make Chef what they want to be, to the extent. Obviously, the commercial products like Chef Analytics and that kind of stuff, they're closed source, so they weren't included. But essentially, the entirety of open source Chef was no longer in control of Chef the company for that entire month. This is how much Chef trusts and empowers the Chef community, which is all of you, to make Chef what we want it to be. They will literally give us the entire project for a month. And what's actually happened since then is Adam has now, so actually one of the things Nathan was talking about was reinforcing how active the Chef community in Europe is. There are now 3 people who've held project lead in Chef. One is Adam, one is myself, and the other is Tom May, who also works for Chef but is based over here. What this now means is Adam's able, because the community meetings are at 9 a.m. Seattle time, which is right when Adam takes his daughter to school, he's now able to do that sometimes. We'll get an email from Nathan saying, could one of you be project lead for the meeting this week? And Tom or I will be the project lead for that meeting. And again, it's that same level of trust and empowerment from Chef that they trust the community to do what is best for the overall project, that they will give us total decision-making power over what goes into the open source product. And we need your help, all of you out there. We need your help to involve yourselves in this community, because the reason Chef is what it is, outside of the commercial products, which are kind of independent, the reason Chef itself is what it is because of the people who helped build it. Of the community at the moment, I would say probably at least 60 or 70% of the component lieutenants are not Chef employees. Decent chunk of the maintainers are because they're paid to do it, but there are also a decent chunk that aren't. So we need all of your help to contribute RFCs, help edit RFCs, be community advocates. A lot of the community advocates, although we act from the best of intentions, are white dudes. Doesn't necessarily give us the perspective or the understanding to deal with all the issues we come up with. So that's another area we could do with help if it's something you feel comfortable doing. Help with that. You don't need to be able to program to basically contribute to the Chef community. That's what I'm trying to get across. One thing, I'll put my contact details up at the end. If you feel you would like to help with the Chef community and maybe you're not confident programming or you don't know where your abilities might fit, I will commit to helping you figure that out. I would imagine Nathan's team on the Chef community side will be more than happy to do likewise. But especially if you come from what you feel is an underrepresented group in tech, I would be particularly interested in hearing from you. To the extent, obviously, you don't know me, some of you may not be comfortable with speaking to me out of the blue. If you're comfortable talking to me, I will commit to helping you try and figure out where your abilities will best fit in the community and try and help you get into the sway of things and how everything works, and try and make sure that you have the kind of experience I did where it's positive and supportive and makes you actually want to contribute. If you're not comfortable speaking to me, speak to someone on Nathan's team who kind of handle the Chef community from Chef Incorporated side, and they'll be more than happy to do likewise. So that kind of finishes the talk part. If you weren't lucky enough to win at rock, paper, scissors, there's a discount code for customizing Chef. I'll leave that up on the slide for a second if anyone wants to write it down. And that's pretty much all I have. So those are my contact details if you want to get in touch. I also have some business cards. I never remembered to take them places, and I did today, so I'm telling you all I have them, because I'm quite proud I remembered. And with that, I'll take questions if anyone has any.
Before we get to questions, I know there are some maintainers and lieutenants in the room also. Would you mind just standing up if you are already a maintainer or a lieutenant of Chef? And can we just give these folks a round of applause and thanks? Awesome. So what questions can we answer for you?
In the month that you were project lead, did any decisions bigger than you had expected come up and you get to say, yes, we'll roll with that?
A few did. Well, there's actually a sequence. Jon Kaiser, who's one of Chef's resident geniuses, was going through a fairly radical refactor of quite a lot of the way that resources go together in recipes. That coincided conveniently with Adam going on holiday for a month. So a large amount of the initial stuff that he was proposing, I kind of almost had to, I really had to concentrate to make sure I understand everything. Like I spoke to him and made sure I understood what he was trying to get across. Because I'd promised I wasn't going to make any particularly significant changes. So I had to try and make sure that these changes were kind of in keeping with the spirit of Chef, understand what was motivating those changes, all the different, because it was a lot of changes, understand everything that made those up. That was probably the biggest thing I had to deal with. That was all basically done and is kind of coming out in Chef now, like how you can much easier specify custom resources. That's a large result of his work. That was probably the biggest thing. A lot of the rest of it was relatively routine.
Just out of curiosity, how much of your time did you dedicate to becoming project lead versus how much of sort of Etsy's time were they willing to give up for you to take up on that role?
I'm lucky in that Etsy are very, very supportive of open source work. Like, it is actually recognized as a part of our job to contribute to open source. In actual real terms, it didn't actually take that huge an amount of time. The main bulk of the time was spent on Thursdays, which is the day the project meeting is, actually doing the project meeting itself. But that particular month, I would spend Thursday morning basically going through all the RFCs that were up for discussion, making sure I understood them, who was proposing them, read the comments to see who had objections, what they were, anything I wanted to talk about. I would say it was fairly effort intensive on Thursdays, but again, like I'd spoken to my employers to make sure that they were aware I was doing this and were okay with it, which they were. So I didn't spring that from nowhere. That was a bit more resource intensive than your average month. Usually, I still do the meetings, and I'll make sure on the Thursdays I go through the RFCs anyway, just in case I have to fill in. But that month, I wouldn't say it wasn't like a full-time job or anything. Like, I wasn't completely subsuming Adam's job. It was pretty much like concentrated burst of effort on Thursday and then just keeping an eye on emails to see what was coming in for the next week, really.
JJ.
I owe you a hug from last year. Can I have it right now?
Sure. This will be your demonstration of hugging. Observe the compulsory back patting. If you meet Americans, this is their custom. They will introduce you to for introducing affection or feelings of joy.
I feel the chef community has changed your perspective of the amount of times Americans actually hug one another. It's still very special.
I think also working for Etsy has kind of changed that too, because they're big huggers in my office. I've become accustomed to this tradition.
Any more questions for Jon before we wrap up?
Just out of curiosity, sort of, did you pick any existing community models when you were trying to put the chef community model together?
A lot of it was driven by the Python community. Noah Kantrowitz, who's Code Ranger on Twitter, was very heavily involved in the RFC model and the general way the community is structured. So I would say, to my knowledge, that was probably one of the biggest influences, the way that all fits together.